I've got a question for you. When in the Bible did God ever ask anyone to do an easy task? I mean, when did God come to anyone and say, I have a job for you, but it won't take long and it really won't require much? And the obvious answer is, He never does that. When He comes to Noah and says, I want you to start the entire human race over with just your family. He comes to Abraham and says, I want you to start an entire new community called the people of Israel. Leave everything you're familiar with and just start moving. I'll tell you when to stop and set up your new life. He comes to Moses and says, I want you to go to the most powerful man on the planet and demand that Pharaoh let my people go. David takes on Goliath. Daniel faces the lion's den. Esther risks her life to change the mind of the king. Paul faces imprisonments, shipwrecks, beatings to start the early church. I mean, the Bible is literally littered with people who God strategically put in places where they have to completely trust Him with their future and their very life. What you see all the way through the Bible is that there's an undeniable relationship between crisis and transformation. There are few biblical characters that I identify with as much as I do Joseph. His life is like this whole series of ups and downs, He starts off and he's daddy's favorite, but his brothers hated him. His dad buys him this special coat, but his brothers rip it off, beat him up, and sell him into slavery. He goes to work for a high-ranking official named Potiphar, and he did really well with him. We're also told that he's a good-looking guy, so Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. He said no to her, but she falsely accused him of rape, and he was convicted for the very thing that he had the strength not to do. It's like his whole life, again, it's just up and down. It almost seems unrealistic. But then again, you've been there, haven't you? I mean, you've got to that place where you finally had your life turning out the way you wanted it to turn out. You finally got that job that you've always wanted, but then the job just turns out to be something you're absolutely miserable in. You finally feel like you get your finances in order, and then you discover a stack of bills that you forgot about. I mean, my question is this: what do you think our response is to be when you go from the good news part of life into the bad news season of life, where everything seems to be falling apart and our desired plan A moves into a plan B that we never asked for and we don't want? I think that there's a question that can lead us into a deeper, more intimate relationship with God if we have the guts to ask it. The key question is this: what would you do if you were absolutely confident that God was with you? See, my fear is that many of us put our faith in God's activity instead of His identity. When life isn't turning out the way we had hoped, we almost always default to feeling as if God has abandoned us. And yet the truth is that God is most powerfully present even when He seems to be most apparently absent. He's always working, even when we can't see Him or feel Him, and all the circumstantial evidence of our lives says otherwise. Now, back to this story about Joseph, because in Genesis chapter 40, it just takes this really weird turn of events. Joseph's now in prison for the very thing that he had the guts not to do in the first place. He's been falsely accused of rape. While he's in prison, he meets two interesting friends. There's a wine taster for the king, and then there's a baker. They both have dreams, and so they come to Joseph and ask him to interpret their dreams. The baker's dream didn't turn out so well, so we won't cover it right now. But the wine tester comes to Joseph and describes his dream. And Joseph says, this is great news. Your dream means that in 3 days, you're going to be let go. You're going to get out of prison. And then Joseph turns to him and he says something interesting. He says, I was wondering, when you get out of prison, would you just remember me? Because I've been forcibly carried off from my family. I don't deserve being here. I have done nothing wrong. Could you just remember me? When you get out and when your power is restored, would you just remember me? It's interesting because I think that a lot of us have been at that place before in our life. That place where you say, God, I just need one thing. I mean, have you ever been at that place where you just prayed, God, just this one thing, like, God, would you heal our marriage? God, could you just please make him love me like he used to love me when we first got married? God, could you please help us with our finances? There's such a mess. Could you you could mix up the numbers at the bank, and nobody would ever know about it. Just God, please, just this one thing. God, heal me of this cancer. God, just this one thing. My wife and I, after we had our first son, got pregnant. And it was a very difficult pregnancy. We were told from day one that there were complications, and it was the kind of deal where once a week we had to go to the doctor and have ultrasound done. And every week we would go in and they would measure the length of the arm of the baby, and they would measure the length of his legs. I remember they would always measure the circumference of his head, and they were just checking for certain abnormalities that they were pretty convinced were going to develop to impact the health of our child. And so every week we would go in and we would just hold our breath, hoping that everything was going to turn out okay. We were praying that God would heal our child. On this one particular visit, I could tell that the nurse doing the ultrasound was just having some issues. Some things just weren't right, and I kept pushing her and asking her questions, and she wasn't really allowed to tell us anything, and so she kept avoiding my questions. And finally, she just said, "Listen, I'm having a hard time finding the heartbeat, but don't panic, because sometimes it's just the way that the baby turns." And she says, "Just hold on one second, I'm gonna get the doctor." And from the moment that she walked out of that little doctor's office, I just started to pray. God, just this one thing. God, just please heal our child. God, I know that you can do this. I mean, I have faith that you can do this. I've seen you do miraculous things before, God. I know that you're a God of resurrections. You could breathe life into this child right now if you wanted to. And I just kept praying that over and over. God, just this one thing. And the doctor comes in the room, and it didn't take him but like a minute. And he turned to us and said, "I'm sorry, but your baby has no heartbeat." It was a difficult day for us. We felt bitter. We felt somewhat betrayed. And if you haven't been there yet, you will be. You'll be at that place where you feel as if God has abandoned you. And you wonder, what's next? I mean, the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what would you do if you were absolutely confident that God was with you? I mean, let's say that your marriage is unraveling and you're hitting the panic button. What would you do if you were absolutely confident that God was with you? Or what if your kids are running from God and you're losing sleep every night just worrying about them? What would you do if you were absolutely confident that God was with you? Suppose you go to the doctor to check out just a few annoying symptoms only to find out that you might have cancer. What would you do if you were absolutely confident that God was with you?